In the summer of 1816, snow fell in June across New England. Farmers watched crops freeze solid under a sun that barely penetrated a sky turned permanently grey. The year became known as 1800 and froze to death. And what's strange isn't just that it happened, but how completely we've forgotten what it meant. This wasn't a local cold snap. This was global catastrophe on a scale we struggle to comprehend today. And the official story, the one you'll find in textbooks, barely scratches the surface of what actually occurred during those 3 years of frozen misery. On April 10th, 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted with a force that dwarfs anything in modern memory. The explosion ejected roughly 150 cubic kilometres of ash, rock and sulphur into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, Mount St. Helens released about 1 cubic kilometre. Tambora was 150 times larger. The eruption itself killed an estimated 71,000 people immediately, but that was just the beginning. What followed was a volcanic winter that wrapped the entire planet in darkness and cold for years. The ash and sulphur dioxide spread through the stratosphere, creating an aerosol cloud the size of Australia that blocked sunlight from reaching Earth's surface. Global temperatures dropped between 0.4 and 0.7 degrees Celsius, though some regions experienced drops of up to 3 degrees. That might not sound dramatic until you understand what it did to the seasons. Summer simply didn't arrive in 1816. In Massachusetts, physician Edward Holyoake recorded ground frozen hard in June, with snow squalls throughout the day and foot-long icicles forming in the shade at noon. Lakes and rivers in Pennsylvania stayed frozen through July. Frost persisted in Virginia into late August. This wasn't weather, this was seasonal collapse. The agricultural destruction was immediate and total. Crop yields in New England fell by 90%. What little corn managed to grow ripened so poorly that only a quarter was fit for human consumption. The rest was mouldy, inedible even for livestock. Farmers who'd planted in May watched everything die. They replanted in June. It froze again. Some tried a third time in July, but the growing season had effectively vanished. By autumn, the reality became inescapable. There would be no harvest. Food prices exploded. Farmers began slaughtering livestock they knew they couldn't feed through winter. The price of meat temporarily dropped as everyone sold at once, then skyrocketed as animals disappeared and no one could afford to raise more. Flour became a luxury item. Families who'd lived on their land for generations abandoned their farms and headed west, joining a mass exodus that would reshape American settlement patterns. Vermont lost between 10,000 and 15,000 residents in just 2 years, erasing 7 years of population growth. Among those who fled was the family of Joseph Smith, who moved from Vermont to New York, a migration that would eventually lead to the founding of the Mormon Church. The decisions made in those frozen summers rippled through history in ways no one could have predicted. But America had it relatively easy compared to Europe. The continent was still reeling from the Napoleonic Wars when the climate collapsed. Crops had already been poor for several years due to earlier volcanic activity, and Tambora delivered the final blow. In Switzerland, it rained for 130 days straight between April and September. The waters of Lake Geneva rose and flooded the city. In the mountains, snow refused to melt even in August. When the harvest failed completely, thousands starved to death in what would be continental Europe's last major famine. The food riots of 1816 and 1817 were the most violent Europe had seen since the French Revolution. Hungry crowds stormed grain markets and bakeries. Governments, already unstable from years of war, teetered on the edge of collapse as tens of thousands of unemployed veterans found themselves unable to feed their families. Some turned to arson. Others organized into desperate bands that authorities feared would spark full revolution. July 1816 remains the coldest July ever recorded in England. The year ranks as the 11th coldest since records began in 1659, with the third coldest summer in that entire span. But the cold was only part of the crisis. Disease followed hunger. Typhus epidemics swept through Italy, Switzerland, Scotland and Ireland between 1816 and 1819, killing more than 65,000 people in Britain and Ireland alone. In Yunnan, China, the crisis lasted 3 full years. Flooding and cold destroyed crops continuously from 1815 to 1818. Peasants resorted to eating white clay to survive. When traditional crops failed repeatedly, farmers began planting poppies instead, more reliable in terrible conditions. Yunnan transformed into one of the world's major opium producers, a shift born directly from climate catastrophe. The eruption disrupted monsoon patterns across Asia. In Bengal, altered environmental conditions in the Bay of Bengal triggered a mutation in the cholera bacterium. A new, more virulent strain emerged and spread from the Ganges River basin all the way to Moscow, then outward across the globe. The resulting pandemic killed tens of millions before burning itself out in 1823. But here's what makes 1816 truly strange. Despite the overwhelming evidence, despite the global scope of the disaster, despite the millions who died and the civilizations that nearly collapsed, we've somehow reduced it to a historical footnote, a curiosity. The year Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein during a cold summer by Lake Geneva. What we haven't asked is why the recovery happened so quickly, why the architectural record from this period shows such peculiar gaps, and why certain regions seem to rebuild with a sophistication that shouldn't have been possible for societies that had just endured 3 years of starvation. The architectural record tells a different story than the history books. Cities that should have taken decades to rebuild were fully operational within 5 years. Infrastructure that supposedly collapsed under the weight of frozen earth and flooding reappeared with surprising speed. Construction projects that should have been impossible for starving populations somehow moved forward. Take St. Petersburg. The city experienced catastrophic flooding in 1816, yet by 1820, massive new administrative buildings stood complete. Buildings with those peculiar oversized proportions. Doorways reaching 12 feet high and interior corridors where grandeur serves no practical purpose. Staircases with risers so tall that climbing them requires an uncomfortable stretch for anyone of average height. The official explanation? Architectural fashion, aesthetic preference, but fashion doesn't explain functionality. These weren't monuments designed to impress visitors. They were working buildings, offices where clerks and administrators spent their days. Why make them physically uncomfortable for the people using them unless those people weren't the intended occupants? Similar patterns appear across Europe during the same compressed time frame. Government complexes in Vienna, administrative centres in Berlin, municipal buildings throughout France, all featuring the same impractical scale, all built or completed during the years immediately following the climate catastrophe, all supposedly constructed by populations that were, according to every historical account, still recovering from mass starvation. The timeline doesn't add up. You can't simultaneously have millions dying of hunger and massive construction projects proceeding at unprecedented speed, unless the construction wasn't done by the starving populations, unless it was done by someone else, or unless the buildings were already there, waiting to be reoccupied after whatever cleared them out. Here's where it gets strange. Tree ring data from 1816 shows something unprecedented. Zero growth. Not minimal growth, not stunted growth. Zero. Oak trees across the northeastern United States simply stopped growing that year, leaving no ring at all in their trunks. It's the only recorded instance of this happening across such a wide geographical area. But if conditions were severe enough to completely halt tree growth, how did any construction happen? How did societies not just survive but somehow manage to build at scales that seem impossible even with modern equipment? The contrast between the documented environmental collapse and the architectural output of the following years creates a gap that conventional explanations can't bridge. Then there's the photographic evidence that emerged decades later. Starting in the 1850s, formal photographs begin appearing of individuals of extraordinary height, not circus performers with documented careers, not medical curiosities advertised as attractions, just people. People photographed in official settings, wearing period-appropriate clothing, sometimes standing beside family members of normal stature. These photographs cluster in a specific window, roughly 1850 to 1900. They show individuals ranging from 8 to 10 feet tall, photographed with the same formality as any other portrait of the era. The technology to convincingly fake such images didn't exist yet. The grain matches, the lighting matches, the shadows fall correctly, and they're always photographed in front of buildings. Buildings with doorways that look absurdly oversized when normal people stand in them, but perfectly proportioned when these individuals appear in the frame. Buildings from the early 1800s. Buildings from the Reconstruction period following 1816. Museums catalogue these photographs, then file them away. The Smithsonian mentions them in passing, categorises them as medical anomalies, moves on. British archives contains several. French collections show similar images. Russian imperial records reference persons of unusual stature serving in ceremonial roles, always acknowledged, never investigated. Why were there so many? Why do they appear during this specific period, then vanish after the 1890s? And why do contemporary accounts describe them not as oddities, but as normal members of society, working as guards, overseers, foremen of construction projects? Newspapers from the 1800s regularly reported discoveries of giant human skeletons. The New York Times in 1885, the San Diego Union in 1895, the Middletown Signal in 1899. These weren't sensational tabloids. These were mainstream papers reporting what was, at the time, considered interesting but not particularly controversial. Skeletons measuring 7 to 12 feet, often found in organized burial sites, frequently accompanied by artifacts suggesting advanced metallurgical knowledge. Then around 1920, the reports stop. Not gradually, abruptly, as if someone decided certain discoveries were no longer acceptable to document. Many of these skeletons were sent to the Smithsonian for study. The Smithsonian now claims no such specimens exist in their collections. Missing, lost, misplaced during routine transfers. Hundreds of specimens, all vanished without proper documentation. The pattern repeats too consistently to dismiss. Discoveries peak in the late 1800s, the same period the giant photographs appear. Then everything stops. The photographs stop. The newspaper reports stop. The questions stop being asked. What if 1816 wasn't just a climate disaster? What if it was a transition point? A moment when one occupancy ended and another began? When buildings designed for one type of inhabitant suddenly needed to accommodate another? It would explain the rapid reconstruction. Not building from scratch, but reoccupying what was already there. It would explain the oversized proportions that make no sense for the populations that supposedly built them. And it would explain why evidence of the previous occupants needed to be systematically removed from the record. Because if the buildings we walk through daily were designed for someone else, if the infrastructure we inherited came from hands larger than ours, then the entire narrative of human progress collapses. We're not the pinnacle, we're the aftermath. Look at the reconstruction records from the years immediately following 1816. The speed is impossible. Cities across Europe and North America rebuilt at a pace that shouldn't have been achievable with early 19th century technology. Within 2 years of the worst climate disaster in recorded history, massive civic buildings were appearing across the landscape. Courthouses, government offices, administrative centres, all featuring the same oversized proportions, all constructed during a period when labour forces should have been decimated by famine and disease. The official explanation: rapid economic recovery, population growth, expanding civic needs, but the numbers don't support it. Vermont lost 15,000 people between 1816 and 1817. New England's population hemorrhaged westward. Europe buried over 100,000 dead from starvation and typhus. Yet somehow, during this exact period of mass death and migration, the architectural output exploded, unless they weren't building from scratch. Unless they were reoccupying structures that were already there, modifying them just enough to make them functional for a smaller population. Adding floors to reduce ceiling heights, installing false walls to make rooms less cavernous. subdividing spaces that were originally designed for inhabitants of different scale. The evidence sits in plain view once you know to look for it. Government buildings from the 1820s and 1830s feature strange architectural choices, load-bearing walls that support far less weight than they're engineered for. Foundation stones massive enough for structures twice their actual size. Door frames within door frames, as if someone installed human-scaled entrances inside openings meant for something larger. Renovation records from the late 1800s describe this repeatedly. Workers removing false ceilings installed decades earlier, discovering original heights of 20 to 30 feet in rooms supposedly built for administrative offices. Finding blocked doorways behind walls, doorways that opened onto nothing because the original buildings extended further than their modern footprints suggest. But here's where it becomes undeniable. The tools themselves survived. Oversized wrenches measuring 5 and 6 feet in length, showing wear patterns from actual use. Hammers with handles thick as fence posts. Industrial equipment scaled for operators who would dwarf modern humans. Museums categorize them as novelty items or specialized industrial tools, never asking why such tools would be manufactured in sufficient quantity that they keep appearing in estate sales more than a century later. Estate auctions across Europe and North America regularly feature furniture that makes no ergonomic sense. Chairs with seat heights approaching 3 feet, desks requiring a standing person to reach their work surface, beds sized for occupants far exceeding normal human dimensions. Cataloguers label them as custom pieces made for wealthy eccentrics, ignoring the sheer volume of such items and their consistent proportions across different regions and time periods. The 1816 catastrophe created the perfect historical breakpoint, a disaster severe enough to cause mass death and migration. Chaos sufficient to obscure what came before, a period of reconstruction that could be documented as new construction, erasing questions about who built the original structures and why they were sized the way they were. Think about the official death toll. 90,000 dead directly from the cold, over 100,000 more from starvation and disease in Europe alone. But those numbers only account for documented populations. What about undocumented inhabitants? What about populations no longer considered worth recording? The photographs tell us they existed. The skeletal remains prove they were real. The architecture demonstrates they were numerous enough to require purpose-built infrastructure. Yet after 1816, after the years of darkness and famine and reconstruction, they vanish from the record. Not gradually, not through natural population decline, but completely. As if the catastrophe provided cover for something more deliberate. Every major city rebuilt between 1816 and 1840 features the same pattern. Oversized civic buildings appearing rapidly during a period of supposed devastation. Construction techniques that seem too advanced for the available technology. Architectural proportions that make no sense for the populations supposedly using them. And always the modifications. The added floors, the reduced doorways, the subdivided spaces, evidence of adaptation rather than original construction. You walk past this evidence daily. Courthouses with 30-foot ceilings in interior corridors, administrative buildings with staircases requiring awkward strides, government offices with windows positioned for sightlines 12 feet above ground level. We've been taught to see them as decorative excess, monuments to civic pride and architectural ambition. But decoration doesn't explain the consistency. It doesn't explain why these features appear across thousands of buildings in dozens of countries, all constructed in the same narrow time window. The year without a summer wasn't just a climate disaster. It was a dividing line, a moment when the old world ended and something new began, when buildings changed hands and their original purpose was forgotten, when evidence of previous inhabitants was systematically removed from official records, when photographs and skeletons and tools all began their slow disappearance into museum storage and archived files marked unverified. We're not living in cities we built, we're living in cities we inherited. The doorways remember even if we've forgotten, the foundations remember, the oversized tools and furniture remember. And for one brief period before the photographs stopped and the newspaper reports ended and the questions became unacceptable to ask, the evidence was documented, preserved in archives and collections where it still waits for anyone willing to look past the official explanations and see what's actually there. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The scale is wrong, the timeline is wrong, the whole story is wrong, and 1816 is when they rewrote it. The official story tells us Canberra erupted, the world froze, people starved, then everything returned to normal. But normal for whom? The buildings that rose from those frozen years weren't built for the people who supposedly constructed them. The photographs that appeared decades later show us who they might have been built for. And the systematic erasure of that evidence, the missing skeletons, the vanished records, the discontinued newspaper reports, tells us someone decided we weren't supposed to ask these questions. 1816 wasn't an ending. It was a changing of the guard, a moment when one chapter closed and another began, and we've been living in the aftermath ever since, walking through doorways meant for different inhabitants, using buildings scaled for hands larger than ours, accepting explanations that fall apart the moment you examine them closely. The next time you enter an old courthouse or government building from the early 1800s, look up. Notice the ceiling height in back corridors where no one was meant to be impressed. Notice the door frames, the window placement, the staircase dimensions. Notice what doesn't make sense for the people supposedly using them, because the evidence never disappeared. It's still there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to recognize what they're actually looking at. The world changed in 1816. The question is whether we're ready to acknowledge what it changed from.